The first note showed up on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks after I moved into a one-bedroom on East Riverside. It was a folded square of yellow legal paper, tucked under the door like a takeout menu, except there was no menu. Just 2 words in careful, slightly shaky handwriting. "Hello, neighbor." I picked it up, turned it over, checked the back. Nothing else. No name, no apartment number. I figured it was one of those building-wide things, some retiree welcoming everyone on the floor, or maybe a religious flyer minus the God part. I stuck it on the fridge with a magnet from the leasing office and forgot about it. For context, I moved to Austin in September 2022 for a job at a software company off Mopac. First time living outside of Ireland, first time in Texas, first time doing pretty much any of this. I didn't know anyone in the city. My coworkers were nice, but the office was mostly remote, so I saw them maybe twice a week. The rest of the time it was me, my laptop, a mattress on the floor, and whatever podcast I had going in my ears while I made pasta. I liked it, actually. That's the thing. I'd wanted to be alone for a while. The second note came 4 or 5 days later. Same yellow paper, same handwriting. "Welcome to the building. It gets hot in October too. Don't let anyone tell you different." That one made me laugh. I remember standing in my socks in the entryway, reading it twice and thinking, all right, whoever this is, they're kind of charming. I still didn't know which apartment. I peeked through the peephole for a minute like an idiot, then went and made coffee. I didn't put that one on the fridge. I put it on the little counter by the door, next to my keys. The third note came about a week later. This is where things start to bend for me. "Are you okay?" That was it. 3 words. Same paper, same pen. And this time when I picked it up, I sat down on the floor with it because I couldn't figure out why my stomach had done that little flip. Because I wasn't okay exactly. My mother had been in and out of the hospital that whole month back home, and I'd spent the previous night on the phone with my sister until 3 in the morning. The apartment probably had every light on. I probably looked like hell through the window from the parking lot. I don't know, but someone had noticed. I told myself it was a coincidence. Generic question. Could apply to anyone. The fourth note came 2 days later. "You didn't go out today." I read it standing in the doorway, and I looked down the hall, both directions, and there was nobody. Just the emergency light humming and that low hallway carpet smell that every apartment building in America seems to have. I stepped out in my socks and walked to the end of the corridor. Empty. Elevator on the ground floor. I came back in and locked the door and stood there for a second with my hand on the deadbolt, because I hadn't gone out. Not that day, not the day before. I'd been on calls with Dublin all afternoon and I'd ordered a burrito on Uber Eats around 8. Somebody knew that. Somebody had been watching my door long enough to know I hadn't stepped through it. I called the leasing office the next morning. The girl on the phone was maybe 22 and had that customer service voice where every sentence goes up at the end. She said she couldn't share other tenants' information, but if I wanted to file a formal complaint about harassment, she could email me a form. I said forget it, thanks, and hung up. I didn't file a form. I don't know why. Maybe because the notes hadn't actually done anything. Maybe because part of me was still curious. The fifth one came on a Sunday. "Haven't heard music from your place in a while. Hope you're not down." I read that one twice. Slower the second time. I do play music. Most evenings. Off a little speaker on the kitchen counter. Old stuff. Mostly. The kind of thing my dad used to play in the car. I hadn't put anything on in maybe a week. Not since the phone call with my sister. Whoever this was, they were close enough to hear my speaker through the wall, or through the door, or from the parking lot with the windows open. That was when I actually started to feel it. Not fear, not yet. Just this weight, low in the chest, of being observed. Of someone else's attention on my life. Uninvited. I started leaving music on when I wasn't home. I bought a chain lock at a hardware store on South Lamar and put it up myself with a screwdriver from IKEA. I stopped opening the curtains in the living room. When I walked from my car to the building at night, I kept my hand around my keys with one poking out between my fingers, like my mother taught my sister, not me, but that's what I did. The sixth note showed up 9 days later. Same yellow paper. "You look lonely." I sat on the couch with that one in my hand and I read it maybe 15 times. Because it wasn't a question anymore. It was a diagnosis. Somebody had looked at me, at whatever version of me was visible through blinds and voices and delivery bags, and they had reached a conclusion about my interior state, and they wanted me to know they had. I decided that night I was going to catch them. For the next 4 days, I basically staked out my own hallway. I set alarms for weird hours, 4 in the morning, 6:15, quarter to noon, and I'd pad over to the peephole and check. Nothing. I ordered a cheap little motion camera off Amazon and pointed it at the door from inside. Nothing. Whoever it was, they weren't coming while I was watching, or they were quicker than I was. On the 5th day, a Thursday, I came home from a coffee run around 3 in the afternoon, and there it was. Yellow paper, folded, half under the door. I don't remember picking it up. I remember dropping my coffee on the walkway and running back down the hall toward the elevator, because I had literally just come up that elevator and there had been nobody in it, which meant they'd taken the stairs, which meant they were still in the building. I hit the stairwell door at the end of the corridor and shoved it open. And I saw her, not a face, a back. A woman, small, maybe 5 feet, with a gray cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders and white hair in a low bun. She was already a full flight down, moving carefully, one hand on the rail. She didn't turn around. I don't know if she heard me. I stood there with my hand on the door, and I watched the top of her head disappear around the landing, and I did not follow. I don't know why I didn't follow. I think part of me had already understood. I went back to my apartment. I picked up the note off the floor. It said, in the same careful handwriting, "I hope you're eating." I sat with that for a while. The next morning, I went down to the leasing office, and I asked casually if there was an older woman living on our floor. Small, gray cardigan, white hair. The girl, different girl this time, smiled and said, "Oh, that's probably the lady in 4B. She's been here forever." I said thanks, and I walked back upstairs and I stood in front of 4B for a good 2 minutes before I knocked. She opened the door on the chain first, just her eye and part of her mouth. When she saw me, she made a small sound, not quite a word, and closed the door again. I heard the chain rattle. Then she opened it properly. She was maybe 75, maybe older. Her hands were shaking a little on the door frame. "I'm sorry," she said before I said anything. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. I know I shouldn't have." I didn't know what to say. I stood there in the hall in a hoodie with a coffee stain on it, and I said, "The notes?" She nodded. She wouldn't look at me. She said, "I saw you moving in, with the 2 suitcases, just the 2, and I thought, oh, that boy's come a long way." She said she'd come over from Krakow in 1982, alone, 24 years old, into an apartment in Chicago where nobody spoke to her for a month. She said she remembered walking to the grocery store and not knowing the word for bread flour and crying in the aisle and going home with nothing. She said she'd promised herself back then that if she ever saw someone doing what she'd done, she'd do something, anything, even something small. "I didn't want to knock," she said. "I thought a knock would scare you. I thought a note under the door, you could throw it away and I would never know. That was the deal I made with myself. If you threw them away, I would stop." I hadn't thrown any of them away. I stood there for a second. The hall was quiet. I could smell coffee from inside her apartment. Real coffee, the kind you make in a pot on the stove. I said, "The one that said, 'Are you okay?' I wasn't. My mother's sick." She put her hand over her mouth. I said, "You were right about the music, too." She invited me in. I said not now. I had to get back for a call, which was true. But before I left, I asked if she drank coffee on Sundays. She does. So do I now. 10 in the morning, her kitchen, the pot on the stove. I still have the notes. All 7 of them, in a drawer by the door, held together with a paperclip. I don't take them out much. But sometimes, on a bad week, I remember there was a stretch of month when someone I had never met was paying enough attention to me to notice I'd stopped playing music, and that she was scared to knock, and that the worst thing prowling the hallway of my building in Austin, Texas, in October of 2022, was a woman in a gray cardigan who had once cried in a grocery store 40 years ago, and never quite forgotten. The project was supposed to run through the end of September, 6 weeks in a working-class stretch of southwest Detroit, houses that used to belong to plant workers, most of them now half-empty or rented cheap. My advisor had gotten funding for a study on neighborhood memory, what people who stayed remembered about the places that had closed, moved, been demolished. Simple enough. I did the interviews in kitchens, on porches, in the back rooms of 2 churches. People were generous with their time. That surprised me. I had expected suspicion, and instead I got coffee, sometimes a plate of food, sometimes photo albums pulled off a shelf without me asking. I met Ray in the 3rd week. A woman I had already interviewed suggested him. She said he had worked at the Cadillac plant on Clark Street until it shut down, and that he remembered everything, and I mean everything. She gave me his number on the back of a receipt. He answered on the 2nd ring, said sure, come by Thursday, he'd be home all day. His house was on a block where 3 of the properties were boarded up. Yellow siding going brown at the corners, a small front yard with a bird feeder, an American flag on the porch that had faded pink. He met me at the door in a work shirt tucked into jeans, even though he hadn't worked in 15 years. Handshake dry and firm. "You want coffee?" "Please." He led me to a kitchen with an old Formica table and 2 chairs. There was a framed picture of a woman on the wall, and beneath it, a small vase with plastic flowers. He didn't mention her, and I didn't ask. I set up my recorder, explained the consent form. He signed it without reading, which I noted, but didn't push on. People his age often did that. They trusted the paper more than they trusted themselves to make sense of it. The interview was, honestly, one of the best I'd done. He remembered the plant like I remember my own hallway, which door you came in through if you were on second shift, the smell of the paint booth in July, the name of the woman who ran the vending machines and always shortchanged you a nickel on purpose, and how nobody said anything because her husband had died and she was raising 2 kids on her own. He talked for almost 2 hours. I barely had to prompt him. Around the 90-minute mark, I asked him if he'd stayed in the neighborhood the whole time. He said yes, same house since 1978. He talked about how the block had changed, which families left, which ones stayed, which ones lost the house to the bank. He said it the way somebody tells you the weather report from a week ago. Then he paused, looked at the recorder. "You want to know something?" he said. "Or you want me to keep on with the plant?" I told him whatever he wanted to say was fine. He nodded slowly, took a sip of his coffee. Then he said, "You grew up in a house with a green front door." I remember laughing, a little, not because it was funny, but because it came out of nowhere. I said, "Excuse me?" "Green front door," he said. "And there was a dent in it, about knee-high, on the inside, from a bike, your brother's bike. He was 5, 6, maybe." I stopped writing. The house I grew up in was in a suburb of Cleveland, 3.5 hours from Detroit. My brother had crashed his bike into the inside of the front door when he was 6. My father had never fixed it. It was still there, that dent, the last time I visited. I had never told anyone in Michigan about that. I had never told most people I knew in Ohio about that. It was not a story. It was just a dent in a door. "How do you know that?" I said. He didn't answer. He kept talking, in the same even voice, like he was still doing the interview. Only now the subject had changed, and I was the subject. He said my mother used to fold laundry on the kitchen counter, not on the bed like most people. He said we had a dog named Biscuit that had been hit by a car when I was 8, and that I had been the one who found her, and that I hadn't cried at first. I had cried later, in the garage, sitting on a bag of potting soil. That last detail, the potting soil. I had never told anyone that. Not my mother, not my therapist in graduate school, not the man I had lived with for 2 years and eventually left. It was mine. It had always been mine. My hand shook a little when I reached for the recorder to check that it was still running. I don't know why I did that, what I was going to do with it if it wasn't. "Mr. Ray," I said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what this is." He drank his coffee. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look pleased with himself. He looked, if anything, tired, the way somebody looks when they've been asked to explain a math problem they solved in their head 20 minutes ago. He said, "You had a nightmare when you were 9, about a room with no windows. You didn't tell your mom because she was already scared about your dad's job that year." He said, "You broke a small ceramic dish, blue and white, when you were 11. You hid the pieces in a coffee can in the garage. Your mom never found them." He said, "In high school, there was a boy named Adam who wrote you a letter and left it in your locker. You threw it away without opening it because you thought it was a joke somebody was playing on you. It wasn't. Every one of them was true. Every single one. Some of them I had barely remembered myself until he said them out loud, and then they came back to me whole, in color, with the smell of the garage, and the sound of the furnace kicking on, and the metal taste of the school hallway in the fall. I sat there for, I don't know how long, maybe a minute. He didn't fill the silence. He looked out the kitchen window, where a squirrel was pulling seed out of the bird feeder onto the grass. Finally, I asked him the only question I could think of. "How do you know all this?" He was quiet for a long time. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The cup said Dad on the side, in the kind of paint kids use in 2nd grade. "I don't know how I know it," he said. "I just know it." He said it the same way he had said the vending machine lady shortchanged you a nickel. No mystery in his voice, no excitement. Just a fact he had access to and had decided, for whatever reason, to share. Then he stood up, rinsed his cup in the sink, dried his hands on a dish towel that was tucked into the oven handle. He said, "I think that's enough for today." He walked me to the door, shook my hand again, that same dry, firm shake, and told me to drive safe. Said the light on Fort Street had been out all week and I should watch for it. I sat in my car for maybe 10 minutes before I started the engine. I remember looking down at my hands on the steering wheel and thinking they didn't look like mine. That's the closest I can describe it. I drove back to the room I was renting on Michigan Avenue. I did not stop for gas even though I needed to. I wanted to be inside a door I recognized. That night, I listened to the recording. It was all there. His voice, my voice, the small clatter of the coffee cup on the table. It had happened. I hadn't misheard. I did not include the last part of the interview in the study. I told my advisor the informant had gone off topic in the final section, and that I'd cut it. She didn't push. Nobody ever pushes on that kind of note. Over the following weeks, I tried to find a connection. That was the sociologist in me, or maybe just the part of me that didn't want to leave it alone. I called my mother without telling her why and asked if she had ever known anyone in Detroit. She hadn't. My father had spent 1 year at a college in Ann Arbor in the late 60s, but he had never mentioned this neighborhood, and Ray would have been a teenager then, and my father was dead. I looked up Ray in what public records I could find. Nothing intersected. No shared employers, no shared family names, nothing connecting my parents to that block. The woman who had given me his number said she had only known him since 2011, when he started coming to the block club meetings, and that she had no idea where he had lived before, only that he had always lived on that street, which was the opposite of information. I finished the study. I defended the following spring. Ray's transcript is in the archive, minus the last 20 minutes. The audio file exists on a hard drive in a box in my closet. I have not listened to it since that night. Sometimes, when I am doing something ordinary, unloading groceries, or brushing my teeth, I will remember another detail he told me, and I will realize he was right about that one too. There are, I have counted, 11 of them. 11 things he knew that I have since verified against my own memory or against my mother's, casually, in ways she did not notice. I do not have a theory. I am a person who is trained to build theories out of what people say, and I do not have one for this. He was, as far as I have been able to determine, exactly what he presented himself as. A retired man who had worked at a plant and lived in the same house since 1978. He gave that interview on a Thursday afternoon in September. It was the first time he had ever spoken to a researcher. It was, as far as I can tell, the first and only time we ever met. I was 3 blocks off Frenchman when I patted my back pocket and felt nothing but stitching, not a wallet, not even the shape of one. That kind of moment where your hand keeps checking the same pocket like the second try is going to fix it. July 2022. I was in New Orleans for a friend's wedding, and the wedding had been the night before. My flight out was noon the next day. I had made the very intelligent decision to spend my last evening wandering the city alone, because I figured I'd never be back and wanted to actually see something besides the reception hall. My hotel was in the CBD, near Poydras. I'd walked out of a bar on Frenchman maybe 20 minutes earlier. I'd paid the bill, tipped, put the card back in the wallet. I remember that clearly. I don't remember what happened between the door of that bar and the corner where I was standing. The wallet had my ID, both my cards, about $60 in cash, and my hotel key card. My phone was at 14%. My hotel was about 2 miles away. I did not know a single person in Louisiana besides the couple who had just gotten married, and they were on a plane to Belize. I walked back to the bar. Not there. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the bathroom. The bartender was decent about it, checked under the stool I'd been on, checked the register area. Nothing. He said sometimes people find stuff in the street and drop it back on the bar the next day. He said I could give him my number and he'd call. I couldn't give him my number because if my phone was going to die, I needed the battery for a cab, or for maps, or for something. And I didn't have any money to pay for a cab anyway. I went into a second bar a few doors down and tried again. The bartender there was slammed, 3 deep at the wood, and he shook his head before I finished the sentence. Not mean about it, just busy. I stepped back outside and stood under the awning while a streetcar bell rang somewhere I couldn't see. It had rained earlier and everything smelled like wet asphalt and old grease from the po' boy place next door. Cicadas or something loud in the trees. The kind of heat where your shirt just sticks and stops trying to unstick. I tried to think it through. My bank's app needed a text code, sure, I could get that. Then what? I couldn't pull cash without an ID from any teller. My email had my hotel booking, but the hotel needed ID to give me another key at that hour, and I didn't have ID. I could call the airline about my flight, but they weren't going to send me money either. My mom was in Ohio. She would send money, but not fast enough, and I'd have to walk her through some Western Union thing over the phone with 14% of a battery in a city she didn't know either. I stood on the corner for probably 10 minutes, just standing, watching people walk past. A group of college guys with go-cups. 2 women arguing about a restaurant. A guy on a bike with no shirt. Nobody looked at me. That's the thing you don't realize until you actually need help. In a city, on a Friday night, nobody looks at anybody. I started walking in what I thought was the direction of Canal Street, because Canal at least had cabs. The bricks in the sidewalk were uneven, and I kept catching my toe on them. Somebody's window air conditioner was dripping onto the pavement, and I remember stepping around the wet spot like it mattered. Every block I told myself I'd ask the next person who looked friendly, and every person I passed I found a reason not to. Too drunk, on the phone. Walking too fast, too many of them together. There was a cop parked on one corner, and I actually walked toward the car, and then I saw him laughing on his radio about something, and I lost my nerve. Didn't want to be somebody's paperwork at that hour. I got to the edge of the quarter, near a little grocery store, with a hand-painted sign, and my phone dropped to 8%. The number just sitting there in the corner of the screen. I remember looking at it and my ears kind of ringing, like the volume had turned down on everything around me. There was a woman sitting on the wooden steps of a shotgun house across the street, 50 maybe, reading glasses pushed up into a puff of gray-black hair. She had a plastic cup of what looked like iced tea, and she was fanning herself with a folded envelope. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was just out on her steps the way people do in that city, because inside is worse than outside. I crossed over. I stopped at the bottom of her steps, not on them, and I did the thing where you hold your hands out a little so people can see you're not doing anything with them. My voice came out drier than I expected. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you. I lost my wallet and my phone's about to die, and I don't know anybody here. I just need to make one call." I had my speech more or less ready. I'd been rehearsing it for a block. I expected her to say she was sorry, she couldn't help. I expected her to look past me and pretend I hadn't spoken. I expected, honestly, for her to go inside and close the door and lock it. She looked at me over the rim of the cup for what felt like a long time. Then she said, "Where's your hotel, baby?" That word. Baby. The way older women in that city say it to strangers. I almost laughed. I told her. She nodded like she was calculating something. Then she said, "Come sit on the step. I'm not letting you inside because I don't know you, and you shouldn't want to go inside a stranger's house anyway, but you can sit." I sat, 2 steps down from her. She handed me her phone without asking who I needed to call. It was an old iPhone with a cracked screen and a case with sunflowers on it. She said, "Do what you need." I called my mom first. My mom didn't pick up because she didn't recognize the number. I called again. She picked up the second time, and I explained, and she started crying a little in the way moms do when they've been scared for 2 seconds. She wanted to book me a cab from Ohio. I told her no, I'd figure it out. I just needed her to know where I was and that I was okay. While I was on the phone, the woman had gone inside for a minute. I could hear her opening a drawer, then a fridge. She came back out with a bottle of water, cold, and set it next to me on the step without saying anything. Then she sat back down with her tea. When I hung up, she said, "Okay, now. You're not walking to Poydras at this hour. Give me that phone back a minute." She pulled up a rideshare on her own account. Not mine. Hers. She typed in the hotel address. She showed me the screen so I could confirm it was right. Then she hit the button. I started to say something about paying her back, and she waved it off. Just waved, like it wasn't worth the words. The car showed up in about 4 minutes, a silver Prius. She walked me down to the curb, which I did not expect, and she stood there while I got in. She leaned into the driver's window and said something to him that I only caught the tail of. Something about her nephew. I think she told him I was her nephew from up north. The driver nodded like, "Sure, whatever, lady." Before she stepped back, she said, "What's your email, sweetheart? Not your phone. Your email. Phones change." I gave it to her. She wrote it on the back of the same envelope she'd been fanning herself with, using a pen she pulled from behind her ear that I hadn't noticed. She didn't give me hers. She said, "You can send me the fare when you get home, if you remember. If you don't worry about it. Get inside. Drink water." That was it. The car pulled away and I watched her in the side mirror walk back up her steps and sit down again and pick up her tea. The driver didn't try to make conversation. He had jazz on low, something with a piano. At the hotel, I had to talk the night clerk into letting me into my room without ID. He was a young guy with a name tag that said Devin, and he clearly did not want to be dealing with this. It took 20 minutes, and a call to the manager and me reading my reservation confirmation off my email at 3%. Devin handed me a temporary card and a printout to sign. I plugged my phone into the wall and I sat on the edge of the bed and didn't move for a while. Don't even remember taking my shoes off. The next morning, I flew home. The airport was slower than usual because I had to go through the whole process of flying without ID, which is a thing you can do but takes a while. I had a spare debit card at my apartment. That afternoon, I sent her the rideshare fare, plus a little more through the email address she'd given me. I sent a note. I said thank you, and I told her I'd been ready for anyone to tell me no, and I said she didn't have to tell the driver I was her nephew, but I was glad she did. She wrote back that night, 2 lines. "You didn't have to send extra, but thank you, baby. Get home safe." I already was home. I didn't correct her. I kept the envelope she'd written on. It's in a drawer in my apartment. I don't look at it much, but I know it's there. I've thought about that night a lot since. Not in a big way, in a small way. Every so often, usually when I read something ugly, or when I'm about to walk past somebody who's trying to get my attention on the street, I don't always stop. I'm not gonna pretend I do. But sometimes I stop, and I stop because of a woman on a set of wooden steps in July, and a plastic cup of tea, and a phone with sunflowers on the case. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed these stories. Tell me in the comments which one was your favorite from the video. And before you head out, check out the other vids on the channel too. See you next time. Bye.